So by way of introduction, I'm Adam Meyers. I'm with CrowdStrike. CrowdStrike's a relatively new startup, stealth mode startup with probably the world's largest marketing arm. you've- uh, yeah. Well, nobody knows what we do. Everybody just knows that we're doing it. Exactly. So we picked a lot of kind of technical talent that we thought would be the people that we'd like to work with when we started the company. So it was started by George Kurtz and Dmitry Alperovich, and I was employee number 3 or number 4, depending on if you ask me or the other guy. And we took some venture funding, and kind of our whole premise is that you don't have a malware problem, you have an adversary problem. And the genesis of this talk is really what goes into an adversary and what makes up an adversary, and then not trying to defend against the attack, but defend against the adversary in a proactive way. So looking at how you can do that and talking about that. And I've got a demo and some cheesy slides, so I'll just kind of keep going. Personally, I'm the Director of Intelligence for CrowdStrike, which is an interesting position. As I was telling some people before, it's kind of like a television show where they've got like the guy at the hotel that's got like every job. I'm like switching hats. I didn't quite expect that. So again, that puts me overseas for 2 weeks or building marketing decks and stuff like that. Prior to that, I was a contractor at a defense industrial base. So I've got a lot of experience focusing on APT or targeted attacks, as I prefer to call them. And I've done a lot of reverse engineering and analysis with regards to that problem. And I spent a number of years supporting the U.S. Department of State in that role. So I was once told that any good presentation, you should start off with defining the problem and kind of setting an expectation for what that is. So information security is hard. Right? We all know that. That's why we're all here, because we like this kind of challenge. So the other thing is that there's adversaries out there that want to do bad things. I realize I'm in Seattle, so some of my Microsoft jokes probably will not go over quite why you little? Yeah. Well, I'll spread it out across multiple vendors, though. I've grown to love Microsoft, and so some of the adversaries that I deal with on a regular basis are the nation-state variety. They're probably, in terms of this problem, the most easy to understand what their motivations are. And I'll talk a little bit about that. But for the most part, they're doing network exploitation, and they have a pretty straightforward goal in what they're trying to steal, depending on what the adversary is. Then there's adversaries like Anonymous. So we've got kind of this group of, to trivialize it, you've got like a group of teenagers that are playing pranks around and hacking companies and doing some pretty nasty stuff, but very different motivation and very different kind of proactive questions that you need to ask into how do you deal with something like Anonymous. So GoDaddy, I kind of put that in as a joke because everybody thought that there was some massive targeted attack against GoDaddy. When in reality they poked themselves in the eye, it sounded like. Anybody here from GoDaddy? Okay. And then PETA, another threat group that's out there. Nobody's looking at me like I'm crazy. I'm serious. PETA. Yeah, well, so in August 2011, Cage Games released something called Dogfighter, or Dog Fighting, which is something that I guess if you're like a Michael Vick in training, this would be something of interest for you. So you can basically fight dogs and, build up your score by fighting dogs. And so they circulated this beta code out there for people to try, and it ended up on some Meyers sites. And then a modified APK shows up with extra class called Rabies. And what happens when you launch this pirated version of the game, the SMS library is it pilfers your contacts and sends out an SMS message that says that you like to hurt small animals and that all of your contacts should just be aware of that. And all of the attribution I've seen on this points to PETA having been behind that. So they don't, to my knowledge, have a very large offensive operations team in cyber for PETA, but clearly they have at least one guy that was bored because it doesn't take much to really add that and put it out onto a wares market. So there's a lot of actors out there. And while I I kind of poke fun at this, but that's proliferation in this space is going to be huge. There's a lot of actors that are out there that really would love to be able to operate against a nation state like the United States or a Western country, or against competitive companies. And I think as we see the understanding and all the great presentations about how APT works, there's a lot of people taking notes and thinking, I could do that. And there's quite a lucrative market for that. So I think we're going to see a lot more of that in general. Now, part of the problem behind this is what makes up our typical IT security team. So there's a lot of different roles, and we've got our technical analysts. Got the manager, right, who tells him what to do. And then we've got our sysadmin, and oftentimes we'll have some sort of policy specialist who, I couldn't find any good tinfoil hat pictures, so this is what I went with, yeah. So we've got these teams that are focused around, dealing with problems in a certain way, but there's one thing that's lacking here and missing, which is an intelligence person. And none of these people, I think, should be expected to do intelligence as a full-time job. Now, here's a kind of segue into why I'm talking about this, is that I've hired some really great reverse engineers, arguably some of the best in the world. And they're doing really in-depth analysis, but when we get down to the intelligence analysis and the attribution side of things, they start to get a little bit miffed and a little bit have a hard time. And if you think about what it takes to build a successful intelligence profile and to do that analysis, it's not somebody that's quite as pedantic as the tech analyst, but you're looking for somebody that's got a little bit more gray area and kind of ability to find that those questions and answer them. So in terms of saving the internet, we throw a lot of resources at identifying bad stuff, and that includes tools, that includes rules, right? So we'll buy all kinds of great tools, and we'll put all kinds of really fancy rules on those tools to, starting to sound like a Dr. Seuss, but we put all kinds of great rules on these tools to really help catch the bad guys. And guess what? It's failing, right? We all know defense in depth is not necessarily going to stop a really targeted adversary that's really got the time and the effort and the resources to pour into exploiting and targeting a company. And I say this, a lot of times we walk into companies to do incident response, and I say we as a community, right? Like we walk in and it's, hey, so you got owned. And they're like, but we bought the firewall, we bought the antivirus, we bought the IDS, we bought, 35 other things that are probably, the same thing, just 3 different marketing angles to them. Why did we get owned? And it's because we're putting these things in place, and we've got a tech guy driving it, we've got a manager kind of responsible for it, but nobody's really proactively looking at what is the threat and how do we prepare and situate these things to defend properly against a targeted attack. So, of course, not being one to just start a problem and leave, I'm going to walk through some of the ways to approach this. And this is going to be really dependent on what everybody's responsibility is and what your goals are. But I think understanding who's owning you really brings you forward in how you can start to think about how do you use these tools and rules from an intelligent perspective to do proactive defense. I think that's what I was supposed to be talking about, right? Okay, so there's lots of great technical analysis published, and I'll say that there's in-depth malware analysis, and you see that reported all the time, and people put out these great reports about that. And then they write rules about how to defend against this malware, whether it be a network-based rule or some sort of host-based solution. And in reality, they're trying to fix the problem that's already occurred. And once the malware has been deployed and it's been successful, doing something about it isn't necessarily going to help the next time, right? So the adversary knows that they've been successful, right, because they've gotten what they wanted. So fixing the problem after the fact is somewhat counterproductive. You want to try and fix the problem before it occurs, or at least know about it as quickly as you can. So a lot of us have kind of given up on being able to stop this, right? So that's fair. that means what we want to do is lower the time from when the attack occurs for the operation to actually be successful. So they get in, and how quickly can we stop them and get on them before they're able to steal our crown jewels or our chocolate milk or whatever. And then there's marketing. So that kind of throws everything off. And my wife just left. She runs our marketing team, so I was kind of glad that she wasn't here for this part of the presentation. A lot of the analysis of cyber events is being driven by corporate marketing. And I'll throw this one under the bus first. Operation Shady Rat, right? That was one of the first kind of market-driven reports that came out that really kind of opened the Pandora's box to people writing reports for marketing's sake. And I've seen reports come out of recent, and I won't point the finger at anybody in particular because I don't see them in this room. And the report, they released something like an internal IP address for a C2 server. Like, in what world is that a network defense that other people in the world are ever going to use, right? So it was a piece of malware that had an internal IP address as the C2. They released a report. They rushed to be the first to release this report. And now you're basically telling everybody in the world, block 10.0.1.2. Like, in what, like, totally market-driven, they wanted to get this out there before their competitors do, and they want to be the first one to name it, right? So I can relay a funny story here. When I was working with the Aurora incident back in 2010 with McAfee and Symantec, and I like kind of pushing buttons. That's kind of my personality. So I was on the phone with the Symantec people. Anybody here from Symantec? Yeah. Okay. And so they said, well, we're talking about the Hydra Q incident. And I was like, what's Hydra Q? And they're like, well, the attack against Google. And I was like, oh, Aurora. And like the line went silent for 3 or 4 minutes while they were trying to figure out how to cope with the fact that I just used their competitor's name for the malware. And that really kind of kicked off this whole, let's get our name in, let's be the first to go to press with this. And I think that pushes some irresponsible reporting that ends up coming out. But what's the outcome of this, right? So nothing. We move on to the next sexy report. We've released our report. We've told everybody to block the almighty and evil 10.0.1.2, and now that's the end of it. We're going to move on to the next report. And then the sales cycle starts. So then we start calling all the victims up and saying, hey, you had a problem, and you've got 10.0.1.2 open on your network, and we're going to come in and help you. And then it just goes back to 10, and we just keep cycling through this, and that's kind of what's going on in the industry right now. So we have technical intelligence, and the technical intelligence that we get is coming from reverse code engineering. We have the indicators of compromise and the reverse code engineering stuff, and it will tie back to some other data, and it'll give us some indicators that we can use to protect our network the next time that the adversary decides to use the same exact thing against us. But we're not looking at the human elements, and I think the human elements are really the key thing to be aware of when trying to understand what's going on with these attacks. Because the person that's driving this attack, they're going to make mistakes. They're going to use the same password. They're going to do a lot of things that we can look for in the future. And if they use different malware, they use some different techniques, they're still going to have a lot of the same human elements, which is something I think that we need to be focused on, because most humans do make mistakes, and they are lazy. Here's the obligatory wiki quote. The key thing here is that I wanted to say that in terms of intelligence and setting the kind of stage for what intelligence means in this area, is we're talking about characterizing known behavior and trying to identify future actions that will be consistent with that known behavior. So one of the big things we have is this intelligence versus technical analysis. And this is the obligatory marketing slide here. You don't have a malware problem, you have an adversary problem. And what we're focused on here is the adversary. We're not worried about the malware, because the malware is going to come and go. It's cheap. It's a commodity that the bad guys are going to be able to spend, as quickly and as easily as they want to. But what they're not going to be able to do is change their people out quite as quickly. So that brings us to the people. Yeah. Yeah. Well, so, and I'll get, yeah, absolutely. The TTPs of it for sure, but the way they use it and the way that they're actually using the tools becomes an indicator as well. So, as I said, there are human beings conducting these attacks, which is kind of the key area here. And while these adversaries might seem similar, they do use tools. They all go after sensitive information of some sort. And they have other compromised hosts and victims. So these are all things that are consistent and similar amongst the attackers. They're not the same thing, though. And that's another issue that we have, is that people are looking at these attacks and they're saying, well, they used poison ivy and they went after my sensitive information, and they also targeted, I have 3 other people that say they were targeted by poison ivy going after sensitive information. So they just kind of get lumped into that category, and then you end up with a generic backdoor.trojan32. So in terms of an intelligence approach to adversaries, this is something that really comes out from the I had a lot of experience with this from the defense industrial base and others, and I think this is a really great way to do this, and I think what Rod was getting to in terms of identifying the tools, techniques, and procedures that are used by the adversary. And these become little nuggets of data that we can use to associate and to attribute who's doing what and when. By a show of hands, how many people have already done all of this? And is this kind of new to anybody, the TTP? Is everybody ready for the drinks? So these become kind of the quantum of how do we identify what is an adversary. So if the adversary is using a specific social engineering attack, we can extract some of the elements of that and put that in the adversary's kind of bucket. And then we'll say, okay, they're targeting our salespeople, and they're using these file names, and they're using this malware and these C2s. By itself, any of those things could be used by any other adversary, but the more you break this up into little kind of quantum and put them together, you end up with a lot more of a fingerprint as to what the adversary is up to and who they are. And No, and that's, I think as soon as you start getting into an automated kind of way of doing that, that's when you start to make, you lose that human element that allows you to kind of do the analysis of this. So, yes, you could do that, but I think that what you need is a human that understands how these things integrate and how they play together, because as I said, there's a human on the other side of this, and as soon as you try to and I've gotten to this argument, it's a great point you raised. I've gotten into this argument a lot with people, usually over a lot of beers, which is that as soon as you start trying to characterize human behavior with a machine, you start to lose the fidelity as to what and who you're tracking. Right. Yeah, absolutely. And that's a question that technical people tend to we want to solve these problems, and I count myself in that bucket, and I've hit this wall enough times that you want to solve these problems by leveraging solution, because the other issue is, are humans on the good guy side, the analytics side, they're also fallible. So you're going to run into the problem of somebody can make a mistake, so we try to remove that from the equation. And I think that that's where we start to run into those issues, where we're, people, you can now have, I just saw part of a talk downstairs where they were discussing being able to counter grouping and different technologies around kind of throwing malware into classification. And I think as soon as you throw Bayesian logic into that, then you start to find that the adversary is going to just really easily counter that by playing against that logic. Does that make sense? Yes. Yeah. Stay tuned for that. No, by all means, like I said, like I'm sweating my butt off up here because I'm like talking to all people that I respect in the community. So I kind of feel like why, like you're looking at me like, all right, we know. But for all of you following on at home, that's a good question. Anybody want to put their hand up? No? No? Challenge accepted. So in terms of how do we do this and collect these TTPs, we need to enumerate what the TTPs are. And I'm actually going to walk through just kind of a quick exercise of how to do that and kind of a simplistic way, and some of the tools that I use to do that and have been able to kind of use to find some interesting stuff. So you enumerate what it is that's going on. You collect this information, and then you want to kind of track it. And this is where we start getting into databases. Are there any DBAs in the room? So that is something that I found to be a continuous problem within all of the industries and all the different people I've talked to on how to do this type of adversary TTP collection, because the database becomes unwieldy pretty quickly too. So along with that Bayesian detection, the database behind it gets a little bit heavy duty. So kind of to get to the point where I talk about how we start doing this, and that's not even really the focus of what I'm trying to get at here. I want to go through the TTPs and how to collect them and enumerate them and identify them, and then talk about the proactive questions that we ask about that data once it's collected. So I'll quickly go through this and just check my time. So I've got about a half hour left here. So we have our bad guy with his non-conspicuous bad guy hat. And as soon as he wants to target an organization, whether it be a defense contractor or some group, they're going to first start off with Google. From Google. Going through, I'm going to kind of flash through this here, but as soon as they start Googling for the organization, they start identifying personnel. They start identifying facilities. They start identifying partners, providers, vendors, and they start identifying these news events and issues. So on a proactive defense standpoint, first of all, this is where you want to start off with your assessment of what is your risk and what is the threat to your organization, because the personnel are who's being targeted, facilities also being targeted, vendors, partners, providers also being targeted, and then this news and events becomes the ammunition that they're going to use to target the personnel and providers. And if they can't get success with this, what they're going to do is they're going to go back and now target the providers and the vendors and kind of try and attack them and move laterally from inside there. So just because you get an email from what you perceive to be a trusted source doesn't necessarily mean that it's trusted and it's safe. So additionally, once they kind of get some of this information, they move forward to the reconnaissance phase. And this is generally the most difficult to detect. When they're conducting reconnaissance against an organization, it's hard to identify these metrics. Once they find the personnel, they're going to use the personnel to pivot to other things. And the way they do that is by looking at social media and then finding connections to personnel through LinkedIn and Facebook and other kind of social networking sites. And we see them do this pretty frequently. And this becomes really troublesome because it's hard to get some sort of indicators or TTPs around reconnaissance when they're using third-party sites. The part where we do get a little bit more visibility on the reconnaissance phase is going to be through, they go and they scan target.com. That's like a generic target, not the company target. They'll start trying to do things like DNS zone transfers, which of course everybody here is turned off, right? But for some reason it's still pretty successful, right? You could get zone transfers out of a lot of organizations. And then they'll spider the website. And spidering your website, they're able to identify things like personnel, org charts, contact information, and documents that are published, right? So now it becomes really easy to say, okay, head of PR, I'm going to take your email and send you a document that has to do with something that's going on in the news right now and say, hey, what's up with this, or I'm going to publish this, is that okay? And then they're going to open it and probably get owned. So the bad guy crafts his email, takes a current event-related subject, gives them a compelling reason to open it. Sorry. I was joking with the Adobe people that they have a campaign in Washington, D.C., where I'm from, and it's Adobe Opens Government. They've got it like postered all over the place, and I've been asking them for a T-shirt because the irony of it is just. So here's a real email that came in, a spearfish that came in, and it went to a sales team. It had a document attached to it. I guess I should use my handy little things, right? It had a document attached to it, a PDF in this case. Not that that's common. And then attached to the factors of the purchase, you should review this and let us know so we can go ahead and give you our money, is essentially the messaging here. And once that happens, the sales guy doesn't even think, right? That's an instinctual, I open this document up. And that's when the fun starts. Yeah, but if there's a sales opportunity, that's... Exactly, yeah. What did I miss? Yeah. I could sell something and use it to buy that Viagra that I've been wanting. So it goes to the entire sales team, and one of them is probably going to be smart enough to open it. And once they do that, obviously the nuclear weapon goes off. We have our malware. It uses a bunch of pretty common APIs to create a legitimate, clean version of the document, and then some custom code to go out and do C2 and open up the real doc, and the user gets that, which was Chinese and looked legitimate to me. I don't really know Chinese, but I don't think any of our sales guys do either. Once the malware ends up on the infected machine, this is where most security solutions and investigators and organizations stop, which is to say we know that the C2 is, we know some of the indicators of compromise, and we can go ahead and move on to the next time that they own us through this mechanism. But what's actually happening is that they're now downloading password dump, they're downloading, dumping the local passwords, they're obtaining user credentials to escalate privilege, they'll offline password crack that, and 30 seconds later they'll come back with a legitimate credential, download a second piece of malware, use the NetUse or some other handy-dandy Microsoft tool to install the malware to the second host. And now they've got a foothold. So even if in the 15 seconds it took for this to happen, you catch on and figure it out, and you stop that first piece of malware, there's now a second piece of malware that's in there, and it's happily beaconing out, and everybody's high-fiving, thinking that they've stopped the first attack. And I've never seen that happen successfully, by the way, but theoretically they'd be high-fiving, and I imagine there'd be beer. And now the second attack is successful and calling home and ready to roll. So this is when it gets fun. The bad guy now starts pushing tools down. So he brings WinRAR, archiver of choice for hackers everywhere, the covert exfiltration tool, and he'll bring a tool bag of other things that they'll use, pass the hash and other types of things like that. And now the mission execution, and this is really where the interesting stuff happens from the intelligence question, because now we should know, right? They're on the network. We should know what they're going to go after at this point. How many people here know what the crown jewels on like your enterprise would be, or a couple of people? Yeah. So I mean, like Adobe would be your source code, right? Or Microsoft source code, or Clippy or something. Yeah. They got to bring Clippy back, man. I miss him. So they'll start by escalating privileges on the machine that they own, and that typically is going to look something like this, where they're the best. The adversaries, some of the best Microsoft systems administrators I've ever seen. So this is legitimately watching them play. So they use tools that I don't even think Microsoft knows is there. They'll use like GP results and all kinds of ways to understand and profile the target network. And guess what? This is a script. And so this becomes a TTP in and of itself, because once they get on and they're using some esoteric Microsoft command, well, that's an indicator of who that person is, because that's how they do things, right? So we could differentiate bad guy 1 and bad guy 2 based on what tools they're using and what order they're using them in on the enterprise. So once they do that, they figure out where all the good stuff is. So the Whopper is where we are going to store all of our nuclear codes and our new games and things like that. And yes, second. Oh, okay. I don't think I've ever been out war game reference before. So once they've, I'll just real quick go back to this. So once they've done this, they understand where the good stuff is, where the domain controller is, and things like that, and they establish a connection and they start pilfering the documents and searching for what they're looking for. And they'll do this over the course of weeks or months, and they'll exfiltrate terabytes of data. They don't care. They'll move it down to that machine. They'll aggregate it. They'll RAR it with a password, and they'll exfiltrate it back out to the bad guy, where he's now going to have a smiley face. So now they've stolen everything that they could possibly get out of your organization. They've got all of your source code, all of your secret sauce, your recipes, your email, and they need to clean up. And they don't want to not come back, right? So maybe you're going to have some new code released in a couple of weeks, or you're going to have some new something cool coming out, Windows Phone 5 or whatever. And so they're going to delete and overwrite the archive because they don't want any forensics people coming and figuring out what they've been up to. And they delete and overwrite the stolen data and most of their tools. And they start cleaning up some of the logs. So they're going to remove evidence of what they've done and who they've connected to from the logs. And they'll burn down the C2 temporarily. And what that means is that they're going to now set that domain or whatever it is to some non-routable or some non-threatening host, so that right now you're essentially owned and you don't necessarily know it, and if all of a sudden they decide they need access back in, it's as simple as turning that domain back on and having access back into the network. So that's how they kind of operate. So in terms of what this means, I said that this is kind of the units of intelligence, are those different TTPs. And there's a lot of TTPs from that attack that we can kind of start to pull together and understand. And we want to map that. And to do that, let me, this is going to be awful with this resolution. Yeah, don't want to be on it. Sorry, this is what, like 460 by 6. I feel like I should be playing a Sierra game at this resolution. So this right here, let me, not quite sure how I can properly display this here. This is an actual attack, right? So this is a tool called Maltego. Has anybody used this? A couple of people? Okay. This is a great tool. It's free. And I've got a bunch of stuff that I'm happy to share with anybody here in terms of entities and transforms. So an entity, this stuff is all custom by me. So this is one of our code-named intruders. We call him Keyhole Panda. And we know that he, anybody want to guess where he's from? We know that he did a spearfish on this date, and we know that there was an MD5 of this that came out of that spearfish. So essentially what we can do is we can start looking at this guy's TTPs and what he does, and we're able to really quickly understand and visualize what this looks like. And when we start mapping out different attackers, we end up with different patterns. So it actually kind of, almost from a high-level glance like this, I wouldn't advocate this as a method of analysis, but from a high-level glance, you can almost understand this is a typical C&E actor, a computer network exploitation actor. It's a very linear pattern, and we can kind of see what's going on. And what we can do is, for example, here's a piece of malware, this update.exe. I can actually run a transform on it. What a transform does is it allows me to perform some actions. So I'm going to query this against VirusTotal. And I should probably turn on my wireless. Otherwise, I'm not going to be able to query virus total. Stuck here. And so what essentially you can do is you can transform the data and automatically map it, and you can use this to take one TTP and tie it back to an intelligence database. So if you have a database with all of your different TTPs in it, you say, okay, here's a MD5, and I know that it was used in an attack. You can write transforms to query that database, and then it'll pull down file names and other attacks that have occurred, and eventually you could even get it to the point where you run one transform and you end up back to keyhole panda. And that's how you start being able to do some attribution. And so here's an example transform. I'll just run it through virus total. No, I won't. I feel like there we go. Stay ping. All right, so I'll try this a third time. Third time's a charm. Go ahead and run virus total. And there we go. So you can see really quickly all that purple that just flashed down there, and I'll zoom in a little bit. Now I've been able to, realizing this is not going to be the most glorious or dramatic revelation here, here's all of the antivirus signatures tied to that piece of malware. Now, when you have 30 different pieces of malware in one targeted attack, and you run this and you start seeing all of a sudden it grouped together, and you'll see, oh, these, there's some similar signatures here that relate to this particular piece of malware. You could start kind of piecing things together. But what you can really get out of this is this mapping, and this is what you'll find something similar. Law enforcement uses a tool called I2, Analyst Notebook, and they map out a lot of criminal activity and things like that using this tool. And I can't tell you how valuable this is for actually doing the analysis and being able to see what an attack looks like. All right, back to the demo. So in terms of proactive defense, right? So I've kind of laid out what the problem is. Cool, thanks. I've laid out what the problem is here. I've kind of established how we start to extract the little nuggets of goodness from an attack and what it actually means in terms of TTPs. And that's great for piecing together what happened after you got owned. But the next thing that gets interesting is how do we proactively use this information to defend, which is kind of where what this talk was focused on. So, of course, that's for the last 5 minutes of the talk. What we're talking about here is intelligence analysis and intelligence collection. These are tradecrafts and things that have been done for years by people that have focused on intelligence analysis, and we're applying it to computer network exploitation. Computer network exploitation is the Department of Defense acronym. For any, I know in Seattle you probably don't get a lot of DoD acronyms out here. So C&E is part of the overall cyber or computer network operations space, which includes computer network attack, which would be disruption or disabling of systems, computer network defense, which is protecting against all of these activities, and my favorite, computer network exploitation, which is essentially espionage. And that's what we have as a big problem, and that's what CrowdStrike's focused on, is kind of dealing with computer network exploitation, so that's why I'm most interested in this. And this could essentially be referred to as a targeted attack. So how do we defend in advance against this? So C&E is an apparatus of a nation state, right? It's directed by a state sponsor in most cases, or if we start thinking competitor, as a targeted attack, whatever it is, this espionage, this exploitation, it's going to have some purpose. It's going to have a tasking to collect certain information. And what that tasking means is it could be strategic or it could be tactical, right? So are you going to be having bilateral meetings with the Chinese in 3 weeks to negotiate the sale of the Windows Mobile 5 phone to China? And that would be somewhat tactical. That would be a somewhat tactical tasking. We want to know what their position points are going to be for making this new device, and how much is are they willing to pay us to do this, right? That's going to focus on the tactical level. From a strategic standpoint, it might be looking at if you're looking at a new business opportunity through or a merger and acquisition or something that's going to have a lot more long-term kind of period of like due diligence and all kinds of other things. They're going to want a strategic tasking to understand what's going on with that actor, or with you rather. And it's going to be somewhat predictable. If you're going to have a bilateral meeting on the iPhone 6 or the sorry, I'll change it up for you. The iPhone 6, right? They're going to want to know about that, and you know that you're going to be coming out with that, so you can understand what they're going to be going after, who they're going to be targeting, and when they're going to be targeting it, right? So I see some people kind of looking a little puzzled here, right? So if you have some great new whiz-bang that's going to come out, and you know that you're making an announcement, you know that there might be some sensitivity around parts of it, the PR program, the marketing, the legal aspects, whatever it might be, then you know that they are going to be trying to get information about it because they want to know before anybody else knows so that they can go buy it or something, right? So that's going to be predictable. We know what they're going to go after, and we know when they're going to go after it. So now we can start to think about proactively how do we defend against that. It might be as simple as going and briefing, the team that's going to be on the marketing PR side of that and say, hey, we want to make you, remind you that there's, targeted attacks that occur around this type of stuff, and you should be on the lookout for this, that, and the other thing, and things like that. The other way that we can help kind of facilitate this is through trending. So we know what happened before, right? We know the last time we were attacked, we built that great analyst notebook chart or that great Maltego chart about how the attack took place. And we know when you last were attacked, right? So the last time we were attacked was right before we put out our first quarter report. And before that was the fourth quarter report. And before that was the third quarter report. Well, a trend starts to emerge there, which is when you put out a quarterly report, somebody might be attacking you. And we know what the vectors were. So we were putting out a quarterly report, and the person from the PR team that handles quarterly reports got owned. Coincidence? Probably not. So we know what they used to own them. We knew that what email they sent, what Word document or PDF document or link they sent. And we know who they were, right? So we've got all of the story as to what happened the last time, and guess what? They're going to do the same thing again, right? And being able to identify this and keep trends about this, you can start to understand and figure out when and where the attack will take place. And most importantly is what was going on in the world, your world specifically, when this attack took place. So was it a quarterly report, or was there some new technology that was coming out? So things that are really common here. Meetings. If you're going to be having meetings overseas on something that's going to be financially interesting. If there's mergers and acquisitions activity. If you're divesting or you're buying or something along those lines. If there's a lawsuit taking place. These are all issues that are going to be of interest to your adversary, and they're going to task their apparatus to collect information about it so that they know what's happening. So I've heard this before, like, mind your own business. Like, you don't need to know what we're doing. You're IT security, or you're, essentially help desk, right? But this is something that we need to fight. I realize that some people are more on the product side than on the kind of internal IT security side here, but reaching out and finding out what other components are doing, understanding, like, are you having bilateral meetings? Are you going to be doing business in a certain country that we're really concerned about? Making sure that you are able to reach out and pull that information is going to be really important. So legal, marketing, PR, this is all groups that really are going to have, they're the ones that are targeted because they're not typically IT security savvy, and they're the ones that have all the interesting information. Again, more reason to target them. So some of the proactive questions, what's coming up on the corporate agenda? Who's the most visible public person that if you Google for, they're the one that's going to be targeted? What would the attacker possibly want from us? So even if we don't know when they're coming, what are they going to go for? Our source code repository is on a server network, and it's it's been isolated because that's how we like to defend our servers, then put something in that choke point to understand, we know that they're not going to be using some Internet Explorer bug or something like that, sorry, about, to target our, they're not targeting our source code repository with that. They're going to be targeting our source code repository on a certain port with certain, maybe trying to find an ODay for that source code repository. So focusing on that and limiting the window makes it a lot easier to focus on what you expect them to do and trying to understand where they're going to be coming from. And it's not 100%, and nothing, I believe, is 100% here, right? We're talking about human factors, so there's always a wild card. But you can kind of start focusing on this and proactively think about, they're not really going to be that interested in, a file storage system that's got nothing on it. They're not going to be very interested in, our printer per se, right? Maybe they are. But by understanding what they're going to be interested in, you can kind of narrow the focus to that. And then again, is it going to be a strategic or a tactical, right? Is there something that we know because we've asked the right questions of other organizations and what they're going to be doing in the next 3 months? We know that tactically there's going to be something of interest, and again, the adversary is going to task their collection apparatus to find out about it. So by understanding that, we can kind of position our pieces on the board so that we're able to best defend against it. So with that, I'll leave off with this pretty funky little you don't have a malware problem. A very subtle, you have an adversary problem. Could be anywhere though, really. And so I'll open it up for questions. I think I'm pretty close to my time here, but yeah, feel free. I mean, I think you got 10 minutes, so. I didn't see a bar downstairs, so if you want to have a discussion about this too, I'm happy to talk about it and take criticism. Oh, okay. Cool. The people? I mean, technically, I don't know that there really is. Technically, I think we understand it all. That's a great question, but I mean, what do you think the most technically challenging? Sure. Sure. Yeah, that's right. But I mean, then the adversary can start playing for that, right? Too, right. So, but I think at the end of the day, the problem isn't classifying the malware; it's stopping this activity. So, when you look at, if you apply those same proactive questions to the malware, they're all going to do the same thing, right? Just like they're always going to break in and they're going to go for your source code repository. It's always going to drop some sort of ASEP. It's always going to try to call out to some domain. It's always going to do expected behaviors. So looking for that type of information is obviously what's going to be the most valuable. So dynamic analysis is a great way to kind of approach that problem because, who cares necessarily polymorphic, not polymorphic, whatever. At the end of the day, it's trying to do something. So stopping that something is what we're focused on.